What do you mean by those words? And if you will simply define your terms with people you're engaging, you can come to see fairly quickly that you can find out you're not on the same page.
Right.
That the words may sound familiar, but they don't mean the same thing. I remember the famous philosopher from The Princess Bride. You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
I told my husband at the height, like the rise of critical race theory, I said, listen, if you want some fast cash, all we've got to do is make a quick jog. We could go into DEI, like oversight, like we could get a 6-figure, jokingly, daily income, just telling people how horrible they are and then promoting this to kids. Like, can you imagine what we could do? And, the running joke is, yes, but at the cost of your soul.
That's right.
Right? My point is this. Everywhere you look, there were people cashing in on this, as you describe in Allie Beth Stuckey's book, which I need to check out, toxic empathy, right? That people are being led by their emotions rather than led by the Spirit of God and led by the oversight of God's word. Talk a little bit about defining terms.
Yeah.
Like we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We talk about justice. How is it that the world uses those terms and we find ourselves using the terms, but we think they mean something different?
Yeah. Well, what I've found in the last probably 15 years of talking about origins and talking about evolution, age of the earth, and now connected to social issues like gender, sexuality, and also CRT, is that defining your terms is of the utmost importance. It really is. And I've actually come up with 3 questions I think every Christian should have in their holster ready to engage people with. And they're really simple. First one is, what do you mean by that? As you're engaging someone on a topic, if you're talking about justice, critical race theory, you're talking about evolution, whatever, what do you mean by that word? For like evolution, for example, when someone says evolution, well, do you mean by evolution, natural selection, adaptation, speciation, dogs make dogs, cats, cats? Yeah, we agree with that. That's what the Bible teaches. That's what science confirms. No problem. But do you mean everything from nothing and life from non-life and information from non-thinking matter? No, we don't agree with that. Science rebuts that, and God's word doesn't teach that. But what do you mean? When we talk about justice, what do you mean by justice? Do you mean right attitudes and words and responses towards people in line with God's word and his nature? Okay. Or do you mean like the neo-Marxist critical race theory definition, which is redistributing wealth and societal power from the oppressors to the oppressed based on superficial characteristics like skin shade, which is what CRT is. It's utterly racist. But what do you mean by justice? Define your terms. Or diversity, equity, and inclusion. What do you mean by those words? And if you will simply define your terms with people you're engaging, you can come to see fairly quickly that you can find out you're not on the same page.
Right.
That the words may sound familiar, but they don't mean the same thing. I remember the famous philosopher from The Princess Bride. You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
That's right. That's right.
That's what we see all the time with all these sorts of things. And so, number one, define your terms. Great question. How do you know? Second question is, what do you mean? The second question is, how do you know? In other words, what is your authority? How do you know that to be true? How do you reach that conclusion? But what is your foundational source? What is your authoritative source to reach that conclusion? And when you ask that question, what you're forcing someone to do is to actually understand they have an authority they're appealing to. And they have 2 options on that authority. Either it's God's word or it's man's. And if they're appealing to man's word, it's utterly arbitrary because why trust one man over another? It's an equal playing field with no absolute truth, ultimate authority set apart. So we're showing them you've got an authority, and if it's not God's word, it's man's word, which is arbitrary. So how do you know? And last one is, why do you care? So to the non-believer, why do you care about justice? Why do you care about the plight of this planet? Why do you care about the rights of women and so forth? Now, as a Christian, I've got great reason to care about all those things rooted in God's word and rightly understood. But why do you care? Because if there is no God, if evolution is true, we're just rearranged pond scum. Why care about justice? One day we'll be extinct with no memory preserved. Why care about any of this? But they care because they're made in God's image. And they're stealing from the biblical worldview and trying to use biblical arguments to argue against the Bible. The fact they can argue at all shows that they're wrong. But anyway, 3 questions. So what do you mean by that? How do you know? And why do you care? And that's good for any issue, but especially engaging on issues of justice to define your terms and to get on the same playing field and really to show them, okay, this is what you actually think built on man's word. This is what God's word actually says built on that foundation to show there's a real difference and that we're fighting really from a foundational fight of authority. And we're trusting God's word, they're trusting man's word.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I remember several years ago when I was told that I was oppressed and I didn't know it, that I was a victim of white hegemony and that I didn't know it. And what was interesting was that I was actually, and this is important for the sake of the conversation, but I was being told this by a white woman who said that I didn't know that I was oppressed, right? That I was oppressed by the man. And of course, I had never met her before in my life. She was commenting on a post that I made that was challenging critical race theory.
Yeah.
And operating in a public capacity, I always feel like I've made a public statement. I am not going to take it personally if you publicly comment on that statement. That's fine, right?
Sure.
But she started kind of getting really personal. And one of the things that I did, and this is to your 3 questions, it's question number 2. One of the things that I did was I said, "Are you a Christian?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Then make a case for me. Your position, make your case from God's word." Well, she came back with all of these links to the experts that I needed to read, all of the critical race theory, the Robin DiAngelos and the, Ibram X. Kendi and all of these people.
Right.
And I just said, let's say that I don't read your books. Make your case from God's word. And can I just tell you, Bryan, the conversation was over. When you challenge them, if people invite you to play ball, right? Like you say, "Okay, yeah, but let's use my ball." Right? Like if you, we're going to use my ball. I'm like, I don't trust your ball and your ball is not reliable. So we let's play ball, but let's use my ball. I think when Christians start doing that, it shows I trust God's word. Like we can rely on his word. He's not going to let us down. We're not going to get out in the public square and be shamed. But I do think that Christians kind of expect to be embarrassed when they're having these conversations.
Homeschool Insights is sponsored by CTC Math. If you're looking for a great online math program, visit ctcmath.com and try it for free. For more great homeschool inspiration and resources, listen to the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday.